Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Wheel of Mind, the Wheel of Time point of view reread podcast. In this bonus season, we are reading perspectives from some of Matt Cawthon's friends. Welcome to what we've been calling Season 2.5, Episode 12, where we are beginning Talmanes' point of view. I'm your co-host, Lajara Dane of the White Aja.
Hi, and I'm Giskel Cimaris, a scholar from Ilion. For any new listeners to our series, I want to remind you that The Wheel of Mind is an in-depth character reread podcast, and we may drop spoilers at random times, so this is your only spoiler warning. Today, we're examining the first four Talmanes perspectives in the prologue of A Memory of Light.
We last left Talmanes in the Towers of Midnight epilogue that we covered in our Alvar episode. Talmanes read Nat's letter from Varen after Oliver showed it to him, and when he went to organize his men to destroy the Waygate, he discovered that Camelin was already burning. It was too late. We find him here in the prologue of A Memory of Light with 6 points of view. We're covering the first 4 in this episode, and we're going to finish up the other 2 along with his last battle points of view next week. Talmanes took half of the band, Queen Elaine had taken the other half to the fields of Nirralor, into Camelin, the streets lined with soot-covered refugees on the way there. He swore to himself, which is the source of the chapter title, By Grace and Banners Fallen, reflecting on how this destruction was worse than when the Aiel took Tyrian. The palace wasn't burning, which could be a good sign that resistance was holding up there, but there was no evidence that the queen had sent reinforcements, suggesting that she was still unaware. That boded very poorly. The refugees blocked his way and kept asking for help. Talmanes had gained a lot of sympathy for common people since he started fighting under Mat back in Cairhien, and he wished he could do more for these people. But he and the hedge doctor Sandeep had to order them out of the way instead. As they approached the gate, it appeared that Trollocs were going to take it. Talmanes had to prevent that, and the further carnage that would follow from blocking more refugees' escape routes. After a brief stint with Isam, then the reader is once again with Talmanes, as he fought and killed a bull-snouted Trolloc. He had lost about 100 men, and this loss was relatively small, but he knew Mat would be very upset. He seemed to take them all personally. But this was the last of the Trollocs from this band that had been led by a Myrddraal, and so more refugees came out of their hiding places and left through the open gate. Talmanes had a painful, wet wound in his side, but largely ignored it for now. Since it was nighttime, he had ordered the guardhouse burned for light, and the guards had been at least temporarily recruited into the band. But he and his men couldn't stay there to hold the gate. They needed to keep the dragons from falling into the enemy hands. He ordered the remaining Queen's guards to use a familiar signal to draw the Andoran peasants toward the safe gate and for another building to be torched as the guardhouses were burning low. He also ordered a few scouts to stay behind and for them to pile up Trolloc corpses as barriers to slow down any shadow spawn. Then he went to the mercenary company he had seen watching them earlier, but who had not joined the battle. He lit a pipe of tobacco and stayed silent as he approached the leader, letting the band's reputation speak first for him. Mercenaries don't work for free, the man in shiny armor reminded Talmanes. Oh, but it's not for free, you see. You'll be greatly rewarded by staying alive. When the man protested, Talmanes then revealed that he had nothing to lose. His wound from earlier was made by a Thakandar blade of a Myrddraal. It was corrupted and blackened. He had a death sentence with only hours left. The mercenaries had 2 choices: to stay, fight, and live to see another day, maybe get paid, or sit around and watch people get killed, insisting that they don't work for free. That convinced the man, and Talmanes went to start recruiting the other nearby mercenary companies. And thus ends Talmanes' second point of view in the prologue of A Memory of Light.
Talmanes here appears to be a man of honor, and I really like that. I like being in his head. He could have done like the other mercenary bands and taken kind of a bureaucratic's point of view. He could have said, well, nobody sent us any orders. Nothing like that. When he stepped outside the tent and he saw the lights from the city in flames, he roused the band and they went wading in. They have no orders from any superiors, nothing from Queen Elaine. In fact, they have absolutely no authority inside the city. But you see, as they clear the gates, he just recruits the gate guards. You're part of the band now. You do this, you do that, and no one questions it. I like that integrity. I like that honor that he's just going to go in and do what needs to be done. and he's not going to worry about the authority that he has or doesn't have. He's not going to take these excuses of what else they could be doing at the moment. And I like the way, once he's done that, he lets, as he said, the band's reputation speak for itself when he approaches these mercenaries who are not joining in. They're not joining in because they're not paid. He did give them this choice of, you can either stay and, yeah, just say we're not getting paid, so we're not fighting. And when this is all over and we win, I will see you hung as a coward. And that was the thing that really, I think, helped to tip the scales in the
Mm,
direction of them joining in. You may get paid later if we live, but if you don't, I guarantee you'll die, basically,
yeah.
was part of the implied threat.
I appreciate
And
you bringing that in since I had left it out of my summary
oh,
too.
no.
That really helps contextualize the end of the point of view there.
But I just see that as a point of his honor, of his being an honorable man. He's going to do what's right, and he didn't bluster, he didn't threaten, and he didn't quibble ahead of time with what he and the band were going to do. Let's just do this. I think it's funny. We get a bit of this irony where he blames Matt, Matt's influence upon him. He considers I'm going to use the word peasants, although when he uses it, we see that other people don't like it. Other commoners who are Andorran, they don't like the term peasants, but he just uses it without thinking. He wasn't really worried about people's feelings, and he'd forgotten everything he learned in his sensitivity classes in HR department. This was just off the cuff. He used the word peasants, but he did consider the common people. He did consider the peasants. He blamed that on Matt's influence, but in a way, this I think is less Matt's influence upon him and more of just his conscience speaking. If this were a typical war where the common people, their only choice is to, either be subservient to this king or that king, they are less inclined to want to have anything to do with a war because really they get nothing out of it one way or the other in typical wars throughout history. They're the ones who bleed and fight, yet they gain the least out of it. But this is instead a war against an enemy who will kill and literally devour every human being in the city if they're given a chance. His conscience just cannot allow him to ignore these. This is imperative that they rescue as many people as they can rescue because you're not just saving them from the influence of a foreign king, you're saving thousands of lives by intervening and risking your own life. Yeah, he blames that on Matt, and I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I see this as more of just humanity. But in true Matt fashion, he has to find an excuse for it.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's a great point that he had to kind of give an excuse. You're spot on about Talmanes. I didn't really notice that tension between what he kind of the reasons he's attributing his feelings to and his actual feelings in the same way that Matt does. I did just notice this contradiction between how he's got this soft spot for the common people. He wants to be able to help them, but he still has this very ingrained Kyrian ways of unconsciously using the word peasants, like you noted. I like the HR sensitivity training thing that you said. And really the only thing that I would add to your points, because I think I pulled out basically the same ones, was that we really see Matt's influence on him quite a lot in that he has a much better head for tactics than most of the nobility we see in, I would say Kyrian, but pretty much any of the nations. Most of the nobility are pretty full of themselves and they value things like cavalry just unconditionally above other branches of their forces, even though they're not right for every situation. But we see a lot of these arrogant lords just want to charge with cavalry and looking down on infantry as being peasants. Because of his time with Matt and because of the way Matt has structured the band with having officer positions for people who didn't come from money and stuff like that, Talmanes has been able to see that there's a much better way of doing things. So here, he uses infantry, which is not something that I think most people in his position might even do, because we've seen that a lot of the military officers in this series, again, just have very poor judgment that's based on a lot of prejudices. But he decides that cavalry would be a disaster fighting in close quarters in this city, right?
Right.
And most of these horses are not going to be trained to be around shadow spawn, even his own. He had to leave his own horse tied up somewhere while he was killing all these Trollocs because he knew it wasn't Borderland trained. It was not going to be able to handle this.
Right.
So the fact that he was flexible enough to use infantry and not kind of turn up his nose at that, it seems very basic, I guess, from a modern viewpoint. That yeah, of course, he would just use the best tools for the situation, but even some of the most basic tactical advantages are a huge advantage over competing nations in this series, because we see what's good about the great captains and the Shan is that they try and learn from their mistakes, which is so basic. But Talmanes has at least cleared that very low bar, and we can see that he probably got that from Matt.
I believe so. I believe just that exposure and seeing how Matt uses every facet of his army in different parts for different situations. I believe one of the reasons that so many of the nobility prefer the cavalry and have this very myopic view or focused view of, use the cavalry. It's the only one that's honorable and does the best is because that's really the only part of the army that most of them have been exposed to.
Hmm.
There's an old Ilianer saying among the craftsmen that if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Mm.
So, if that's the only thing you're used to using, then no matter what the situation, you think to use it. But here we see that because of Matt's influence, because of his all his borrowed, stolen, given memories, however you want to describe them, that he uses every part of his army, whatever gives him the advantage in that situation. And Talmanes has learned from that. And so, yes, I agree. He's very focused on what will work in this situation, not what am I used to using and which man am I the most, you know, comfortable around, but what is going to bring success here. So in many different ways, he's kind of channeling Matt. I believe at one point he even, and it may be in the upcoming part. I forget which part of this it's in, which one of his points of view, but he's like, well, Matt would come in with some kind of spectacular genius, crazy idea that would work. And Talmanes doesn't have this, sudden inspiration, but he uses what's at hand. He uses it flexibly and uses it well. He cares about the men. It bothers him that he's lost 100 of them. Hey, in street warfare, house to house fighting, which is horrendously difficult against a foe that is 1.5 times your size and weight. I mean, this is awesome. Very few military groups could have gone in and done what they done and lost as few a people as they had. Yet that still
Hmm.
bothers him. And again, he couches that in the terms that, well, Matt will be upset. But I think Telmont is upset.
Yeah.
Um, we also have this very Matt-like situation where we don't see him wounded in his fight with the Fade, the Lurk, the half.
Yeah.
Um, we know that it happened. We're told that it happened, but we're not told the specifics. We don't get to see it happen. So it happens off camera, just exactly like happens with so many of Matt's great moments. They
Mm.
happen off camera, so to speak, and in a way that it adds a little bit of mystery to the story. It leaves you wanting a little more. And perhaps that's one reason why, in almost every character point of view, we wind up discussing on our podcast how we wish we had a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that. And I wonder how the story keeps going. And I attribute part of it to this that so many things happen off screen, so to speak, or off page. But, we see Talmon is doing really well on his own, using his own initiative. His first focus is on holding those gates. That's step one. And it's almost like a programmer. Here's this subroutine. We've got to get that going. Then once that's completed, then we're going to start, burning certain buildings, piling up Trolloc bodies for cover. And then, we're going to pull in these mercenary bands and we're going to take the next step. And it's just kind of, from A to B to C. He's got an end goal in mind, but he he's staying remaining flexible enough that they can adjust to the moment and use whatever they've got. And again, that's something I believe he learned from Matrim Cawthon, and that makes Talmanes just a great character because for so much of the story he has been sort of a minor character, and we have so many parts of the story where he's been kind of a like you said, a straight man to match humor. You know,
Mhm.
something to kind of bounce off of and see the play between, the verbal play between he and Matt that is, it just brings up so much humor, so much dramatic irony. But here we see him as a doggone good leader of men in battle.
And I think that is a good conclusion to this little chunk of points of view because I had pretty much exhausted my notes about it. So, are you ready for your summary of parts
Yes,
3 and 4?
yes, I am. Thank you. For when we say parts 3 and 4, this is simply Talmanes' parts. We're
Mhm.
skipping other points of view in between of By Grace and Banners Fallen, which I love the name of this prologue. We find that Melton, one of the members of the band, gives Talmanes an old borderlander first aid treatment for his fatal wound. Blisterleaf was there to slow the poison, although nobody knows how it works, and Shinar and Brandy to help with the pain. Now, Telmanus was hesitant with the brandy, but Melton assured him that at some point the pain would cloud his mind worse than the brandy. Melton then honored him with the name Dreadbane because he had killed a Fade, and promised that when Talmanes was ready, that Melton would end his pain quickly if Talmanes gave the sign by holding up two fists. The mercenary groups were left behind to defend the gates, and the band was pushing up the hill toward the palace, the only place in the city where they could see no flames. He made the decision to go for the palace first, then try for the dragons. You see, perhaps there would be channelers at the palace who could help them, and everyone knew that the dragons moved slowly. But man, it was tough. The city was filled with bands of Trollocs, and there would be fighting uphill all of the way. Then we have some other points of view and then pop back into Talmane's thoughts again in the middle of a battle when he surprises a Trolloc by attacking it and killing it. The group of Trollocs ahead of them were entrenched, and the band really had little hope of breaking through that line. And now it looked like another fist had flanked them and were coming up from behind. There was really no more retreat for the band. They might split up into small groups, and some of the band could sneak away to the gates, but no, instead, called for an attack, and the band did their best to push forward, while some of the crossbowmen climbed atop a building and began firing on the Trollocs. It would not be enough to save them. They were just too badly outnumbered. Then suddenly the Trolloc lines ahead of them fell apart as Andorran pikemen came rushing in from a side street, led by Gaibon. After an exchange where they each basically thanked the other for coming to their rescue, Talmondas pumped Gaibon for information. It seemed that Dark Friends had killed some of the channelers in the palace, and the remaining two were not strong enough to form a gateway. The palace was filled with refugees, and there was not another good way of escape. They then received reports that Trollocs had taken the city walls, but the defenders still held the gate for the time being anyway. Between them, they decided that Gaibon would disobey his orders to hold the palace. He would leave half his forces there to hold for a while, men who would later sneak out a back way and try to make for the southern gate. He and the rest of his men would fight alongside the band to bring the refugees out and try to rescue the dragons along the way.
Talmana shows in these sets of points of view that he works under pressure so well. I mean, not only is this pressure of being in a battle situation and being the one in charge anyway, he's been doing that for a while. Matt left him in Murundi and he helped the king consolidate some of the territory there. And, so he has done this kind of stuff on his own. Even before Matt came along, he was an officer in Kyrian, but he's having to make difficult choices under that pressure with which he's probably familiar, but also the pressure of knowing he's only got a few hours left with this corrupted wound. And I think he does pretty well considering just how difficult the options are between worse and worser. None of them
Yes.
are good. He's having to pass by refugees who are calling out to him for help, and it's really tugging at his heartstrings. He's having to basically kind of yell at them in an authoritative way in our first chunks of points of view there to get them out of the way so that he can actually get into the city. He's having to light official buildings and businesses on fire, which has got to be extremely difficult. He's got to destroy many parts of the city in order to save the people of the city. But this is they're the ones who would have had any livelihoods left or anything if their businesses had been untouched. He is going ahead and destroying. He has to decide whether to go to the palace, where it looks like there's probably strong resistance, it's not on fire at least, or get to the dragons first. Both of those are difficult because whichever one he chooses, he's going to have to leave somebody hanging. Obviously, the dragons are end up being the higher priority, but I don't think any of these choices are easy for him. But he is working extremely well under these pressures. He ends up making all of the right choices to just barely be able to save, large chunks of the Camelot population. And he's humble about it. He doesn't want the accolade of being called Dreadbane. He is like, well, I was the one who dealt the killing blow, but the Fade already had 17 bolts in it, so it wasn't really me who killed it, right?
Right.
He doesn't care about that glory. He also thinks that he, like you said earlier, he would have a really hard time filling Matt's big boots as a leader, but he's really doing it here. He's very much fulfilling Matt's legacy for the band and hoping to leave behind a good one by just being able to save a few people. But he doesn't want to be here doing this. He's not like, oh, this is the best way I could go out by saving a few people with my last few hours. He wants to chill. He wants to have a nice, peaceful, have a lie down in a chair with
Right.
a cigar and a book. And so he is very much like Matt, as you noted before, but I'm still just very much impressed with how much he doesn't want to be here. How, like you said earlier, nobody ordered him to be here, but he's jumping in, making the difficult decisions, and getting things done anyway.
Yeah, I really liked that little part where he said, "Who wants the glory of battle?" He's wishing for, to sit by the fireside in his favorite chair with a book and, some tobacco and just have a quiet, time, even a quiet death rather than a death in glory in
Hmm.
battle. And I did think of Matt with that too, and then I thought, but in a way, isn't that the wish of every soldier?
Yeah,
Because
probably.
I know different people have different motivations, but there are so many men that I've met and well, men and women who've served their country who are, they're good people, they're decent people, they're peaceful people, but they've been called on to do very violent things in order to protect those that they love. And in this case, they're taking this risk on to protect humanity because again, this is all out war. This is not a war among nations or a war among kings. It is the light against darkness. It is life against death. And they're trying to protect just their right to exist and to live. So they're willing to do very violent things and very difficult things and very tiring things, but they're they're doing it for a reason. It's because they long for peace. And really that's
Mm.
not, although as I said, not everyone has that motivation. I think that is the picture of the typical military person, no matter what country they serve, is to serve their country or to serve the people they love or to protect their families back home. And they will do very violent things, but they don't long for violence. They long for peace. And, you've already talked before how he's showing this humility and yet at the same time great leadership. And something I didn't think of until you brought it out. From the entire time that Matt was in Ibu Dar, going through that huge, what seemed like a 2-year story arc, Talmanes was leading the rest of the band,
Mm.
and he didn't just double their numbers. It was like 4 or 5 times larger
Mm.
when Matt rejoined with them than it had been when he left, and they had the money to pay them all for a year.
Yeah.
So he had shown a lot of initiative and a lot of leadership, and in a sense, he was riding on Matt's coattails, but
Hmm.
had he been a bad leader of men, he would have squandered those opportunities, I believe, but instead
Yeah.
he built on them, and, so, yeah, we see he's a good leader of men, and, he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, I think he has been a good steward of Matt's men who follow him, and he's really getting to put that on display for the reader here. He has demonstrated this before to Matt, but it was off page, and getting to see him do this for the first time on page is really interesting. We get to learn more about who he is,
Yeah.
how he makes decisions so quickly under pressure. It's still interesting to me. And speaking of pressure, I like how he keeps putting pressure on Gibbon, and I know you and I pronounce that name differently. There should be another one of our disclaimers. We do our own
Yes,
things with pronunciation. Get over it.
yes.
um, so
We're not going to change. Yes.
no, no, because I just think it's funny to me to pronounce it sort of French. I think he sounds funny that way to me. But anyway, Gibbon is the last one of them to have received any orders from Elaine, from what I understand, because Talmanes had been working, the band had been working with Andor and kind of working for her, but they didn't fit into the command structure of the Queen's Guards or any of the royal forces of Andor or anything. So they were both getting independent orders from Elaine before she left for the last battle. Well, I guess this is also the last battle, really. It's just
Well,
also in
yeah.
Camelot, when they
Right.
left for Marilor. And so Gibbon's orders, even though Elaine wasn't expecting any fighting here, his orders are to stay at the palace, from what he understands. And he's supposed to hang on to this to preserve the traveling grounds and keep those safe. And Talmanes keeps pushing back at him and putting pressure on him so that they can agree on some kind of strategy together to both meet their goals. I think that was risky of him because Gibbon really could have continued to resist, but it was interesting to see them out of necessity kind of join forces to a single plan. And it just shows how persuasive Talmanes can be when he needs to be. He didn't have to pull the trump card of, I've got this Murdral wound like he did with the mercenaries. But it was interesting to see him convince Gibbon, who had been incredibly loyal and just needed to kind of stay at his post from what he understood.
Right. This kind of fits into a thought I had as well that, we see Talmanes here, I think, at his best with this and the upcoming points of view that we're going to have with him in the prologue. We see him really at his best because in his mind, he's at his last. These are his
Mm,
best moments because he thinks he's at his last moments. Uh, I think most people have stopped and thought about, what if I knew I were going to die tomorrow? What would I do differently today? So he's faced with that. He believes within the next few hours he will be dead. So, let's give it everything we got. Let's refocus our priorities. He could have been basically charged with insubordination, even though he did not
right.
answer to Gibbon. He he did answer to Elaine at this point.
Hmm.
And unless Matt withdrew from Camlin, I mean, he has to answer to Elaine. So, yeah, he could have been brought up for insubordination by basically countermanding her orders, but he did understand her orders were based on the assumption that Camlin was safe, not the
Right.
fact that Camlin had been besieged from within and that it was just entirely in chaos at this point. And I believe Gibbon had a desire to save the palace, which would be important because it almost city within a city. They had a lot of people in there, and he didn't see a safe way out. And it took a lot for Talmanes to show him, yeah, you're following your orders, but those were based on one set of facts, and that does not apply here.
Mm,
Everything has changed. If you can't get in touch with Elaine, then she has no way to give you different orders. But here's what you really, really, really need to do. And the decision they made that they kind of joined in together and joined forces, it saved a lot more lives, and it
mhm.
saved the dragons because I do not
Right.
believe at all that the band had enough people to pull that off. They would
Mm,
have been lucky
right.
to get out of the city alive to rescue the dragons on their way. I don't think they could have done it
Right,
without
because they're
having.
so slow and you would need so many people defending them
Right,
and
right,
know that you would probably need to lose very many along the way, to
right,
defend such a slow caravan. It leaves you so vulnerable.
right. And Talmon is determined to either rescue those or destroy them so the shadow can't use
Mhm.
them against the humans because they're so devastating right now. And just the power of the dragons is something no one has really thought of before. he doesn't try to rescue them at the cost of saving the 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 population of the city too.
Hmm.
As many refugees as they can rescue along the way, they rescue. So,
Yeah.
again, these kind of multiple targets here, this is our one objective, which is getting out of the city and getting as many of these refugees out as we can. And along the way, we're gonna rescue the dragons so they can be used later. And along the way, we're gonna whatever we can do. I think the decision to burn many of these buildings behind them eh, I mean, it's a good one, it's a sound one. I say behind them, around them. It prevents them from being flanked immediately. The Trollocs are going to burn them anyway. It's one way of
Yeah.
looking at it. Some buildings would have survived. In a city that huge, they probably didn't lose more than 40% of the buildings throughout this entire thing. But, it was just an effective way to try to rescue as many people as they can, and part of that means keeping the Trollocs off of us, so we don't have to fight them to get out. We keep them away with the flames so they can't get to us, and we can get out. So I'm sure that was an extremely difficult decision, but it's literally a scorched earth policy. I
Hmm.
used to I used to wonder what that phrase meant, and in this part of the story, you could see it. Hey, the building's gonna be burned anyway by the Trollocs or by us, so let's do our part, leave nothing behind that they can use against us. Leave them no cover that they can hide from and come out and attack us. We do what it takes to get out and save as many people as we can and save these dragons. So, yeah, multiple tasks going on, yet going on very effectively and not letting those goals collide and stop one another.
Yeah, I don't know how he can think that effectively while his wound is raging like it is. We see it affecting him physically, but really not so much mentally. At least yet. I think he gets worse later on in the prologue before he gets
Yes.
better. So we will see about that next time. But otherwise, I'm pretty much out of notes for this section too. What about you?
As am I. These are shorter sections to cover, so
Hmm.
maybe that's one reason I've grown so verbose, trying to add a little more to it. These were short points of view, but they're important points of view, and I think they are very it's very worth our time to look at Talmanes here and try to understand him as a character. So we see a man who, even though we had no points of view back in Kyrian when he first joined the band, um, he followed Matt for honor, for what he had seen Matt do during that Aiel-Kyrian war back in Fires of Heaven, and he stayed with him, I think, out of loyalty and out of friendship, and I think that Talmanes was a good military leader in the beginning, as we've seen him through other people's eyes, mainly Matt's. But I think now he has become a great one. He has, in my mind, the potential to become one of the great captains of the land following the last battle, which hopefully there will be no more wars and no more need for captains for many generations. But I think he's a man who could potentially step up and fill those shoes because we see how resourceful he is and how intelligent he is. And as you said, just he stayed on task and yet was still his mind was very agile and quick, even in the midst of this tremendous building pain that simply gets worse and worse. But he never stops. And so we see one of those things I admire in so many characters in the Wheel of Time is that innate inborn stubbornness that carries them through these very difficult situations. And I admire that. Well, I hope all of you listeners are enjoying this as much as we are, and I hope you'll all join us next time for Interlude Episode 13, when we'll finish Talmanes' point of view in the prologue of A Memory of Light, parts 5 and 6, as well as the Infinite Chapter 37 and Chapter 41.
There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the Wheel of Mind, but this is an ending. To catch a beginning next time an episode drops, subscribe to the Wheel of Mind on Podbean, Stitcher, iTunes, or Spotify. You can also find our episodes on YouTube under the channel name Lajara Dane. That's Lajaradayne. We'd love to hear how we're doing, so leave us some feedback by rating and reviewing on whichever platform you use to listen to us. You could also contact us by emailing lajaradane@gmail.com or finding the show account on Twitter at mind_wheel. To support the show and get access to some perks, subscribe to us on Patreon for just $3 a month by visiting patreon.com/wheel of mind.